Hey guys, I'm Komodo Dragon Jesus. I'm a professional cash game player and a Twitch streamer for the 888 Poker Stream team. As a professional player, I study a lot. I use solvers basically every day. And when I'm using solvers, sometimes it can be a grind, but the most fun I end up having, the most interesting moments for me are when I discover something unexpected, something new, something where the solver might take a line that I would have never taken. And I feel those moments are also just great learning opportunities to better understand the game of poker as a whole. So I'm making a short video series here where I'm going to share some interesting spots with you. And the goal of this series and this video is not to analyze a certain hand. It's not to show you spots where you might be having leaks and how to fix them. The goal is to present you with an idea that you've probably never seen before, and then it's up to you what you want to do with that information. So for this example, I'm going to be using the GTO Wizard AI solver. I've recreated these results in PO Solver as well, so if you want to explore this a little more, you should be able to use whatever solver you have access to as long as it lets you tweak bet sizes. So here's our scenario. Under the gun raises, big blind defends with a call, and the flop is ace-4-4 rainbow. Big blind goes for a check primarily, though there is the occasional small bet. Under the gun then has the option to put in a small bet themselves. Typically you'll see something like 1/4 or 1/3 pot here. And then in response to that, big blind will either fold, call, or make a fairly substantial raise for a little bit larger than the pot. And the reason that the big blind gets to make these big raises fairly aggressively is that big blind actually has a pretty cool nut advantage here. If we take a look at the ranges, under the gun we'll have pocket aces, one combo of ace-4, and a little bit of a fraction of combos here of 5-4 suited and pocket fours. Meanwhile, if we look from the perspective of the big blind, there's this entire column of fours. There's a few extra here, including hands like 5-4 suited. So big blind actually has quite a few trips plus here. And if we look at the equity buckets here in the center, we see for hands with 90+% equity, the big blind actually has them more than twice as often as under the gun. And now, so this is basically how you're going to see this hand play out every time. Maybe you'll see something weird going on once in a while, but this is the standard way for this hand to happen. But there's actually another way it could play out. I mentioned there's a little bit of a lead range on the flop here for big blind, but this lead doesn't really make sense. If you have a nut advantage, then you want to generate a big pot. What happens if you go for a small bet is you bet 1/4 pot as the big blind. Under the gun will then never raise you if they're playing correctly. They'll call you very often, and you get to the turn, the pot is still small, you're not accomplishing your goal. So a cool thing about the GTO Wizard AI solver is they actually have an algorithm that chooses the best bet sizes for you when you run it. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And we should see something unexpected here. There it is. Guys, this is a leading range for 284% pot, nearly triple the pot. Not only that, the leading frequency has also more than doubled. So suddenly big blind, given the correct sizing option, gets to be a lot more aggressive. And this strategy seems a lot more in line with what the big blind wants to do. You don't want to throw out a small bet, get to the turn with a small pot, and then go from there. You want to push that nut advantage that you have. You want to generate a big pot, and apparently the optimal size for that is nearly triple pot. So that's fun. Now let's kind of explore what happens here. So big blind has the ability to go for a triple pot lead. Under the gun will then fold a lot, but defend a mix of top pairs, as well as every single pocket pair from kings through deuces. Now, this might be a little bit unintuitive if you've never seen it before, but in this situation, top pairs and pocket pairs are basically the same thing. Big blind is representing a range that's primarily three of a kind or bluffs, and against three of a kind or bluffs, it doesn't really matter which pair you have. And if you think about how these hands will actually end up winning, I mean, of course, big blind could be bluffing, you can call down and win that way. But if you're thinking about ways to improve, the way that an ace beats a 4 is by hitting one of the 2 remaining aces in the deck. One's on board, one's in your hand, there are 2 left. There's also another way, with your kicker hitting a runner-runner, so hitting something like 10-10 for ace-10, jack-jack for ace-jack, but that's going to be very rare. Now, with pocket pairs, it's basically the same thing. If you want to improve with kings, you have exactly 2 outs in the deck, the remaining 2 kings. Same with 10s, same with deuces. So all of these hands are roughly the same value, and we see by the mixing and by the EV numbers on screen that all these guys are basically 0 EV. Ace-8, 0 EV. Pocket 10s, 0 EV. So it doesn't really matter which ones you continue with. The one advantage that pocket pairs do have over aces is that if you actually improve your hand on an ace, it's going to be extremely hard to actually get value. You'll have a board that's ace-ace 4-4. Your opponent will be very hesitant to put in a lot of money with his 4s, and of course his bluffs are going to check fold at that point. While something like pocket jacks, if you hit the jack on turn, then you're still stacking a 4 every single time. The reason that we see that some of these aces have slightly higher EV than the pairs is because big blind's range is not just purely trips or bluff. There are the occasional top pair being overbet as well. And when that happens, those top pairs are actually ahead of these pocket pairs. So it's a very small difference, but that's the reason you see that. And if we were to, edit the sim and remove those aces from the leading range, then the pocket pairs would actually perform better than the top pairs. If we want to see how this plays out, it's not terribly exciting. There aren't really going to be any turns other than exactly an ace that change the board texture in a meaningful way, which means after big blind bets, under the gun calls, if we get a random turn, big blind will just continue with large bets, not quite as large this time. You don't need to get it all in over 2 streets. Under the gun will just call with a very similar range of hands that they did on the flop. A lot of mixed aces, a lot of mixed pocket pairs. And then on any given river, you'll see the same thing. Big blind gets to go for bets, and under the gun will make some calls. With top pairs, looks like these pairs aren't calling on this run out. Now, the only real way for the texture to affect the play here is, again, either an ace coming in on the turn or river, or if a backdoor flush comes in specifically for diamonds or clubs. Because if we look at under the gun's range, the diamonds and clubs combos of every single ace are, for the most part, coming along. There is basically no fear of a spade flush, and of course, you can't make a heart flush at this point. So there it is. You now have a new way you can play an ace 4-4 board. It's a bit ridiculous, but that's kind of the point. And it's not just this board, but I've been able to recreate this on a few other textures that basically involve an ace and a low pair, where one player will have significantly more trips than the other. And now that you have this knowledge. The question is, should you actually play this way? Should you just stick with check flop, check raise against a bet? And that's kind of up to you. I'm going to throw a few extra ideas out there for you. First, I'll say that this line is strictly better. It's strictly higher EV than a strategy without the ability to lead like this. If it wasn't, Solver would never take it. Now, the difference is going to be minimal. It's going to be like 1/100th of a big blind or something like that. The solver is very precise. It matters for the solver. In your real games, it probably doesn't matter that much. The place where it's going to matter in your games is how your opponent is going to respond to such a line. Now, everybody has studied hours and hours of c-bet flop, defend against check raise, or c-bet flop, c-bet turn. I can basically guarantee your opponents have not been up against this line. And if you study this line and your opponent hasn't, then there's a very good chance that they're going to make mistakes. And if they're going to be making mistakes, things can get a little bit silly. So let's stay at the flop here. Big blind goes for a bet, under the gun defends. Now, I think facing triple pot, we're never really going to get floated by king queens. 6/5s for a backdoor straight, backdoor flush. So I think it's fairly easy to assume that all of those are still going to fold. But your opponents are going to have no idea what to do with their aces and their pairs. And Solver has no idea either. It just mixes everything, but it does it at the correct frequency. So what actually happens if your opponents are making frequency mistakes on this board? So there's two ways that can go. One is if they call too much. The other is if they call too little. And the GTO Wizard AI Solver has the ability to node lock. So let's take a look. So first thing I want to explore is what happens if they call too often. Let's take this 74% fold frequency and just tweak it a little bit. Before I do that, I'm actually going to lock all these silly, ridiculous hands over here. Because when messing with this feature before the video, I was getting some weird results where some of these hands do actually start floating. So I'm going to go ahead and lock that. I'm going to set this to only overwrite unlocked hands. And we're going to say instead of folding 74% of the time, let's make that 69, a 5% shift, nothing major. Looks like it starts bringing in the occasional raise. That's fine. The thing we're focused on is that they're not folding as often as they should. Now we can go ahead, lock everything, node lock, and see what the response should be like from the big blind. And so the result here is big blind tightens up a bit. Rather than leading 10% of the time, they only do it 7.5. And that makes sense. A good chunk of your leading range is going to be bluffs. If your opponent's going to call too much, why are you bluffing? Now, this strategy still has bluffs in it. There's things like the king deuce, the king 5, 6-3. So there's still bluffs. There's just fewer of them. And since this is a solver, it's thinking ahead. It's thinking about how it's going to play on turns and rivers. We're not locking any strategies on the turns and rivers right now, so it's going to want to have bluffs to utilize on those later streets, and it can make these ones work. So that's what happens if your opponent calls too much. You just get to be value heavy. Pretty simple. What happens if your opponent folds too much? And this is something players doing node locking have looked at forever. If you're on the button and your opponent folds too often to c-bets, how do you respond? You typically just respond with a lot more c-bets. If your opponent is c-betting into you and folds a lot to check raises, you just check raise like mad. Now, this is a bit of a different situation because we're not talking about a 1/4 pot size bet here. We're not talking about a 1/3 size bet. We're instead talking about triple pot. But we can actually go in here and tweak. Our GTO fold frequency was 74. We moved it 5% in one direction to see what happens if villain overcalls. What happens if villain overfolds? So 74, that brings us to 79, 5% in the other direction. We're going to go ahead and lock everything and see how the big blind plays. So that is a small overfold, and the result is you get to bet basically your entire range for triple pot. That sounds like fun. Okay, so I'll admit that this line is pretty new to me. I only discovered it recently thanks to the sizing algorithm in GTO Wizard's AI solver. I've tried it exactly once, and when I did, it wasn't terribly exciting. I just bet big on flop and my opponent folded. But the more I think about it, the more it's something I want to try, especially given the fact that players typically tend to overfold to a ton of different bets in a ton of different scenarios. This could very well be one of them. And if that's the case, then suddenly this ridiculous strategy is looking a little bit more attractive. Now, if you guys think this is interesting and you want to try it out on your own, if you do manage to pull off something fun, please, please, please let me know in the chat. I would love to hear about that. And there you go. Now you guys have another weapon in your arsenal, a new idea that you can use to outplay your opponents. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys learned something. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below.